NASA has proven every technique necessary to fly a spacecraft to the moon. Now it was time to begin Project Apollo, the program designed to accomplish this task. The centerpiece of this is the Apollo Command and Service Module. But before she could fly to the moon, first she has to be proven in Earth orbit. For this, NASA built the first generation of the Saturn rocket family, the Saturn 1B. 8 engines in its first stage lift the Saturn 1B through powered flight. The first men to ride it were the Mercury veteran Wally Schirra, joining rookie astronauts Walt Cunningham and Don Isley in the flight of Apollo 7, the shakedown cruise of the new Block 2 spacecraft. The Block 2 would undergo several serious changes and upgrades since the fire of Apollo 1, which cost the lives of astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. While a loss of that magnitude would have certainly grounded any program to a complete halt, Gus's own words in an earlier press conference confirmed that he would have wanted the program to move forward. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life. Our God-given curiosity will force us to go there ourselves, because in the final analysis, only a man can truly evaluate the moon in ways understandable to other men. Gus was certainly a smart man. Now, he didn't always have the best handle on how to deal with the press. In fact, it's known that he actually didn't have windows on the front side of the house he built for his wife Betty, because he didn't want people or the press looking in. Now, sometimes people think of him as a cranky SOB, and he was at times. But he was a talented engineer, an excellent pilot, an incredible astronaut, and an incredible man. In fact, many betting circles placed him to be the first man to walk on the moon. It is unfortunate that Apollo 1 cost his life, but I don't imagine him wanting to go out any other way. Maybe in a space mission, but certainly as part of the program he loved. As we complete the first stage of powered flight, much like other spacecraft before, the vehicle splits virtually in half. Leaving the first stage behind and firing the second stage, lifting the now lighter vehicle for the remainder of powered flight. This is the Saturn 4B booster stage, which would send the command module and lunar module on its path toward the moon when used in the larger Saturn V rocket. But for this mission, it'll just take us in orbit. After achieving sufficient velocity and altitude, separation motors fire to separate the escape tower. Now, if there were a problem up to this point, the escape tower would remain latched onto the command module, and if necessary, pull it free, whether there was a failure in the vehicle itself, or whether it veered off course and had to be destructed. While Apollo 7 only tested the command and service module, which had performed beautifully, Jim McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Schweikart would utilize the same launch vehicle to also test the lunar module in Earth orbit in the flight of Apollo 9 less than a year later. As we work on straightening out our orbit, sooner or later I will figure out how to do this in a single burn. Well, underdid it there, but I can correct that. Once we successfully reach orbit, the Apollo Command and Service Module separate from the booster stage and continue the remainder of its mission. Apollo 9 would have found the lunar module tucked away inside, but we'll save that for a later program. After Apollo 7 and 9, the Saturn 1B launch stack would not be utilized again until after the final moon landing, for the 3 flights of Skylab several years later. Now, the Apollo spacecraft itself is broken up into 3 parts. As I get out of shadow here. In fact, I'm going to save that until I smooth out that orbit. That is a little too low for me. Naturally, every satellite that reaches orbit encounters atmospheric drag that will eventually bring it down. Well, fortunately, it's not quite as big a problem here, but if your orbit is below 70,000, then yes, you start to get drag and start to pull down. So, let's fire the main engine. And get back into sunlight. Now, as I said, the Apollo spacecraft itself is broken up into 3 parts. The crew cabin in the nose, which we referred to as the command module, contains the living space for the 3 astronauts. There are 3 couches at the main control panel, which can be tucked away during flight, the lower equipment bay below their feet, where the command module pilot would serve as navigator for the flight, and the storage bay behind the 3 stowable seats. While serving as command pod for the flight, the only actual operations the command module itself can complete is re-entry. Behind the heat shield is the service module. Within the cylindrical module lay the spacecraft's oxygen and hydrogen tanks, not only for breathable air, but also catalysts for the craft's fuel cells, to ensure operation longer than traditional batteries would allow. Additional electronics for a long-range communication system, as we see the extendable, well actually we don't see it. Well, the extendable antenna didn't get attached here, but it would stick out the side. A scientific equipment module would also be housed within the side of the craft. And this is for analysis of the moon during lunar orbit, as well as the craft's pass-through for the radiation belts. And finally, propellant for the 3rd part, which is the single propulsion system, or SPS engine. In lunar flights, the engine would be used to brake the craft into lunar orbit, and then boost out of orbit for the return to Earth afterward. In the case of Earth orbit missions, it's simply used to boost into higher altitude, and then finally retrofire to bring the craft back into atmosphere. Let's go ahead and bring it down while we're still over the water. No actual NASA spacecraft is ever specifically designed to land on land. Some Russian spacecraft have been given that ability, but America was never really one for land landings. Until the shuttle, of course, because you need a runway to land that thing. And normally during a re-entry you'd have a much shallower entry path, but I really want to hit the water. And of course your angle of trajectory is a major concern in actual flight. And perhaps that'll become a portion of Kerbal in later updates. After retrofire, and the spacecraft is in proper angle for re-entry, the service module is jettisoned. Hopefully not twisting the craft around like that. Leaving only the command module to complete its re-entry. Although we won't see this particular process here, the Apollo spacecraft will actually enter the atmosphere twice. The first approach for initial braking provided by the atmosphere, and after this phase, the craft rotates, changing its angle thanks to its off-center of mass. For example, the center of mass, rather than being directly in the middle, is more off-center, about down here. So during first re-entry, it would be angled more down in this position to duck into the atmosphere. And then for the second phase, the craft rotates back in the attitude that allows it to reach out of the atmosphere. Actually, correction, I had that backwards. It would be this way to brake and go down, and then tilt down this way to provide some lift, to lift it back out of the atmosphere. Traditionally, an orbiting craft is traveling nearly 18,000 miles per hour, but an Apollo spacecraft returning from the moon would be reaching upwards of 2,500, far too fast for the craft to withstand a straight shoot re-entry. So as the heat of re-entry subsides and the craft slows after ducking back out of the atmosphere, it dips back down and then brakes back in the atmosphere once again for its final phase. So basically it becomes a skipping rock. It ducks in, takes up heat, skips out, and then sheds the heat that it generated, and then skips back in. And after the craft emerges from radio blackout, at which time the drogue chutes deploy, pulling the nose cover free, and then deploy the main parachutes underneath, slowing the Apollo spacecraft for its slow descent into the water. Now occasionally after splashdown, the CM has been known to settle nose down in the water. For this, inflatable bags deploy to flip her back into the upright position and prepare for final recovery. Crew returning, their mission completed, and Apollo can now begin its ultimate goal, to land on the surface of the moon. And as we descend down toward ultimate recovery, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I am K1, and you have been watching KerbalOdyssey on Cymax TV, the sci-fi view of the universe.